Overpainting is a common issue that can result in muddy colors, overworked areas, or even damaged paper. Watercolors require a very delicate approach, which is why I created this winter composition so I can share my favorite tips to help you prevent overpainting and overworking your paper. As always, I will take you step by step through each layer of color, naming the pigments I use and highlighting the strategies that help me find a good balance between detail and restraint and keep my watercolors very light without compromising the vibrancy and the details. So let's start with an outline, and I will share my first tip to help you prevent overpainting. This one is essential to keep in mind even before you start painting, and it's all about avoiding erasers at all costs. Watercolor paper is extremely delicate because it's made with cotton, and even a slight disturbance in cotton fibers will interfere with your colors later on, creating muddy and uneven blends. Then of course we can be tempted to go over these patches and fix them, which only makes it worse. So use a light pencil, and if you feel like you would rather trace, then trace it. I said it before and I stand by what I said. There is no shame in tracing outlines because drawing requires a completely separate set of skills. Of course it's very important, but you don't need to worry about it if you're just interested in learning and mastering watercolor techniques. Of course, the reference has to be copyright free, and you can download mine in the video description below, and I will always provide black and white outlines for all my Patreon tutorials, including this one. When the sketch is ready, we can apply the first layer of paint, starting with the bird on the left. Everything we do in this layer has to be very, very light, very watery, which leads me to tip number 2. We need to plan and layer our colors to avoid overpainting. So start with a light wash or so-called underpainting to build the foundation of your work. Then gradually layer your paint, and I will show you all my layers in this painting so you can control the depth and details, reducing the tendency to overwork too early in the process. I wanted to start with red bellies, and if you noticed, I've pre-wet my paper first on top and at the bottom to make sure my red pigment, this is called Scarlet Lake from Winsor Newton, can spread softly into those areas and gently disappear into the background. My first application is quite watery because I want to make sure I cover only the belly, and once I mark up this area and I'm happy with the shape, I can add more saturated pigment right under the neck, letting it spread in every direction. Under the wing, you can drop some purple. I'm using Dioxazine Purple, my favorite pigment from Quor, and even some blue to indicate the shadow part. But notice how light my pigment is. I'm never reaching full saturation in this first layer because I know we will have lots of opportunity to do so later. Now let's repeat the same process on the second bullfinch. And notice that I'm even putting a little bit of light pink on top of the wing. That area is technically blue, but it also gives a hint of warm brown in the reference photo. So I'm prepping the surface with my light Scarlet Lake, knowing that it will mute that blue that I will be adding later on because watercolors are transparent. It's very subtle, but it shows how much preparation and planning can go into the smallest details when you layer step by step this way. Now, you may be tempted to do the dark parts, but the secret is to let everything dry completely. So this is my tip number 3 for avoiding muddy colors and overworking your paper. Appropriate drying time is absolutely essential. I can't tell you how many paintings I've ruined by rushing and layering my colors before the first washes were dry. It's really simple, and you can work on another area like I'm doing on the berries, or start a new painting altogether. I always have several watercolors on the go, and this way I'm never tempted to overwork too soon. Okay, almost never. I think I showed you in the previous portrait video. Quite a bad example of when I just couldn't help myself, but that was the whole point of that video, to show you my mistakes. So here I'm going slowly. I will paint the first layer on the berries and make sure the birds are completely dry before I come back and add the blue. My tip number 4 to help you avoid overpainting is to begin with larger brushes to block the shapes and areas of color. Larger brushes encourage broader strokes and prevent getting lost in intricate details too soon. I'm using a Skoda Chronos in size 2 here. Now you might say that size 2 is still quite small, which is true, but this is a very small composition, and I will gradually switch to 00 brush as I get to darker, smaller details later on. Typically, I start with something like size 3 or 4 and then work my way down to 00. For my blue underpainting, I'm using a combination of phthalo blue red shade. You can use green shade. They're quite close and they're not granulating. I'm mixing in a little bit of that same dioxazine purple from Core just to create some visual interest and add an intermediate step between blue and red on the belly. So my palette is starting to look more and more cohesive. Let's finish the branch with some burnt sienna. You can use any brown of your choice, just keep it light and avoid those smaller patches of snow because we will outline them later. Before I start working on the second layer, on the birds, I will leave this painting to dry overnight, which leads me to tip number 5, take breaks. Step away from your artwork periodically. This will allow you to see the whole piece from a distance, give you a fresh perspective on what areas actually need work and which ones should be left as is. This is particularly important for watercolors because they tend to dry out a lot lighter than when we first apply the paint. If you consider your results immediately after you put down the layer of color, it can be quite deceiving because the water makes everything look a little bit more dark and more vibrant. Once the water evaporates, everything looks a few shades lighter and quite more pale than what you may expect. It's only obvious if you take the time. So, as you can see, I'm now applying the first truly dark layer on the birds, working on smaller details, the eye and the wings. And you might be surprised to hear that I'm not using black color. So this is my tip number 6 for not overpainting. Avoid using black straight from the tube. First of all, it looks harsh and unnatural most of the time, and you can also mix your own. We already talked in some of my videos about different recipes for making natural blacks, but more importantly, pure black will never blend well with your surrounding colors. And that's one of the things that leads to overworking, playing around with colors too much, and even creating a bit of mud. I'm using indigo here, which is a mixture of Indothrone blue and Payne's gray, and it gives out a subtle blue tint, and it also blends so much better when I water it down and put it on top of my vibrant blue. In those areas where I want the results to look pure black, I simply use a very saturated version of indigo with very little water. And it's so much better and so much more subtle than a lamp black or any other black that you will find in the tube. Now it's time to come back for our third and final layer. I'm going to use my smallest brush and add very, very subtle strokes, all mimicking the direction of the feathers to add some subtle texture. This technique is called wet on dry, meaning I'm applying wet paint on previously painted dry surface. Notice how small my strokes are? I'm not disturbing any paint underneath, building depth and dimension slowly. This is my tip number 7. Use wet on dry to make things darker in the later stages of your work. What I mean by this is I could theoretically re-wet the paper in some of these larger sections of the wing or the belly and add some darker colors using broad wet into wet strokes. But that's exactly one of those things that often leads to overworking, especially if you're painting on like 50% cotton as opposed to 100% cotton surface. By this stage, your paper is exhausted, and by re-wetting the surface, you risk lifting that first layer and ending up with very muddy patches. It's much easier to build depth and texture to add value, meaning to add darker colors, using these precise wet on dry strokes without disturbing the paint underneath. I will now add some subtle outlines to the snow using that same phthalo blue. And I will also apply darker details on the berries using again the same indigo that I've used before. Notice that I'm starting to recycle my colors as I go along, so I will mention another quick tip, and that is to limit your color choices because it can simplify the process and prevent overcomplicating the artwork with too many colors. Now, if you've been on my channel before, you might be completely shocked to hear that I even brought this up because I typically use like a million pigments, but a limited palette is a relative term. For me, a limited palette is 7 or 8 pigments maybe. For another artist, it can be 3. I generally don't shy away from introducing a ton of color variation. For example, I could have easily mixed red and blue to make purple, but I went with the Dioxazine purple because I like that pure, vibrant look of straight from the tube pigment. But what I'm trying to say is that it's all a spectrum, and you may want to recycle your colors here and there instead of introducing new ones. For example, I'm mixing my purple with burnt sienna to avoid bringing in a darker shade of brown, and it suits me well here because on the secondary objects like this tree branch, the parts that are less important where I'm not too concerned about having a lot of color variation and visual interest, recycling your pigments actually simplifies the process and prevents you from making mistakes and overworking some of these areas. Last and probably the most important tip for avoiding the mud and overpainting is to know when to stop. Again, this may sound funny coming from me, but it's true. We need to recognize when the piece has reached a stage where additional work might not add significant value. So sometimes leaving certain areas slightly unfinished or suggestive can even add character to your artwork. For example, I'm going to use these berries to illustrate the point. Berries are really like a supporting secondary object here, and we can get away with just one simple layer of red, plus maybe a few darker details here and there. All we have to do is just capture the essence, the main elements of the shape, which is why I'm not gonna do another layer of red like I did on the birds. Those small white highlights that I left throughout are more than enough to indicate that the surface is shiny and that the shape is round and reflecting the light. The berries that are further away don't even need that small highlight. I covered them in the first layer completely, and this helps me show some depth and the difference in distances. I'm very tempted to add more, but I will leave them just like this, having a little bit less definition than the birds. I do feel like the heads and the beak can use some darker color though, so this is my third and final pass on those areas, and I know I won't be adding more, so I'm using fully saturated indigo finally, using it without any hesitation, reaching an almost opaque look. I hope you enjoyed this demonstration, and if you're into painting birds, then you can check out this tutorial on my channel where I summarized my favorite techniques for painting all sorts of birds, and the full real-time version of this tutorial with outlined step-by-step photos and detailed commentary will be available on my Patreon later in November. Don't forget to leave a like, it means a great deal if you enjoyed this video. Subscribe, and I will see you next week. Thank you for watching and painting with me.